Thank you very much, Mrs. Joseph. And I feel very distinguished to be referred to as a good friend and colleague. I wish to say a very hearty good morning to the listening public, both locally and in the diaspora. Of course, we are into the fourth week of the after event of the passage of Hurricane Maria. We have suffered widespread destruction to our beautiful nature isle. And I wish to put into context for most of us listening the magnitude of the ferocious Hurricane Maria. We had a Category 5 hurricane, which officially would have wind in excess of 156 miles per hour. As is usual in any hurricane, you have occasional gusts. And as I said, the word occasional, so once in a while. Fortunately or unfortunately for us, we had an island, a contracting firm, which had a wind measuring equipment or instrument. And they were able to measure wind speed, sustained wind speed of 220 miles per hour. Now, my dear brothers and sisters, irrespective of whether you're in the first world, the second world, or third world, this is catastrophic in any area whatsoever. Unfortunately for us in Dominica, we had this massive event coupled with a few irregularities as far as our construction habits and practices are concerned. And I say construction habits and attitude deliberately again, because in the construction process, we have to look at the entire spectrum. Of course, if we keep it on the residential note, we all know that one of the largest investment in any person's lifetime would be construction of a home. Unfortunately, in that we also have the issues of certain tendencies where some homeowners may wish to take matters into their hand. I won't go too much into that because Mr. Roll is there and is the building control specialist here this morning. But we all can attest to the fact that many a times we submit approved plans to physical planning, of course, but we see often what is implemented in the field is quite contrary to what was approved. And that is because the fact some of us believe because it is our home, we can take matters into our hands and we can instruct the contractor to leave this out or put that space that one a little wider or so. But I'm saying all that to mean at the end of the day, we were able to sustain losses of in excess of about 80% of our residents being impacted, or buildings being impacted. When I refer to building, of course, I'm referring to the residential stock, the commercial, the industrial, and as well as institutional. Institutional, of course, hospitals, schools, police stations, and what have you. We keep it within the residential sphere based on the official records that we have, which is based on the census, the last census that was carried out in 2011. We have approximately 24,600 homes in Dominica, 24,600 families. We take 80% of that, it means roughly 19,700 homes were impacted. And in the small country of Dominica, if you had that amount of homes impacted, it means the entire country was impacted, either directly or indirectly. What does that mean for us going forward, as Mr. Joseph asked? First, we have to start with a very thorough assessment. And the reason for the assessment is to find out what is the effect of the damage and to be able to put that into context to find out what's the impact of that. And based on the impact, we look at our needs and our demand or requirement going forward and how do we strategize going forward. And from the government point of view, as you heard, the Prime Minister have been championing the cause from day one that we're going to take this adversity and we're going to build back better. And I have been trying to develop some humor among my colleagues because you know sometimes you have to uplift yourself in those times. For those of us who are old enough or young enough, we remember slates. In the days of my primary school, you used to have slate. And when you erase that slate, you better have a very photostat memory what you have there because you ain't getting that back. So for us in Dominica, it's almost we have a clean slate now, and how we intend to build back is paramount on the quality of life we want to get tomorrow. And of course, as you heard, the PM has been saying, we have to build back the resilience of this country. And it affords us the opportunity to be able to do that properly. And to do it properly, we have to take into consideration standards We have to take into consideration construction practice, building codes, and to tell you what standards are basically a technical specification as to how you should do something. But this is one thing, to know what is required. It's a different reality for enforcing or ensuring that you carried out what is required. And so for bridging that gap, we now goes from standard to codes. And codes are basically law and regulation. And that is why you will refer to things like the physical planning codes. So when physical planning comes on the site and he talks to you with the backing of the law. And going forward, we have to understand it. And I was saying to Mr. Roll up to yesterday, we had a very formidable discussion. You now have the wonderful platform to tell most of the stubborn homeowners and contractors, especially the homeowners, who take pride in saying something, but why government want to tell me how to build my house? It's my house. And I was saying to him, maybe he has the opportunity now to ask them, who is the burden right now? The burden is that of the state. So clearly, we will be able to put into perspective why it is necessary that we do things properly. So going forward, after, as I said, we have done the assessment. The assessment will enable us to strategize. And as you know, we have three distinct fears to deal with. We have to deal with the immediate relief, we have to deal with recovery, and we have to deal with reconstruction. In the relief and recovery mode, we have quite a number of our colleagues and our friends and families residing in shelters. Most of the shelters are institutions, either school or community center, and things of that nature. Clearly, government is not in a moral or in a responsible position to tell the people in the shelter to go out to the streets. So one of the strategies we'll be doing, in the assessment we're doing right now, we have a number of teams in the various communities as we speak, carrying out the actual assessment of the buildings. And we'll be able to target some of the shelters, and in the shelters being able to identify the people in there, the condition of the homes. And based on the conditions of the home, we could come up with strategies in terms of recovering some of the buildings so that we could get the people back into their homes and being able to put the schools, for instance, back into use. The schools are very important because we know as young, impressionable minds, school children or school kids or young people are easily very impressionable, can be easily distracted. And so we really want to ensure that they engage very gainfully in learning, and the best place for learning is within a closed classroom. So that is one of the strategies we will take, and government will be able to make an informed decision after it has the credible information as to how it strategizes going forward in terms of the whole rebuilding for who and when and what. This is very important to put into context going forward in terms of looking at the codes. And when we speak about codes, we also have to put things in historical perspective. I'm not a historian, but I give a lot of respect in regards to historians, and Dr. Honeychurch can attest to that. He is one of the mentors to me, and I always refer to him. For us in Dominica, even our building codes were somewhere between 1992 and 1996. You will realize, for those of us young enough or old enough, we suffered a blast from Hurricane David in 1979. However, after Hurricane David in 1979, which was after a very long time, we never had any experience of a hurricane in Dominica. However, shortly thereafter, somewhere in 1986, we had the ferocious Hurricane Hugo that decimated a number of countries in the USVI and Puerto Rico and what have you. And shortly after, we had Hurricane Andrew in 1992. So we realized then, based on empirical evidence and historical return period, statistical analysis, those things were happening too often now. So we had a wake-up call. And as a result of the wake-up call, we had to go back, one, to a cubic with the Caribbean Unified Building Code for the entire Caribbean spectrum from CARICOM initiative, where we were able to put into consideration all the hazards that we are affected by in the region. And for those of us, we know most of the hazards that we're concerned about is hurricane, and of course, earthquakes. Came Erica recently, we all realize now very seriously flooding is also another problem for Dominica, and also landslide and disturbed slopes. But from that event after Hurricane Hugo, the Caribbean saw it fit to engage academia and the industry and came up with the Unified Building Code for the Caribbean somewhere in 1986. Now, even during this time, during the cubic code, basically, we would take the Andrew experience into consideration, say 150 miles per hour, 155 miles per hour wind. You compare that now with what I said we had in the case of Hurricane Maria. We're being told there's winds in excess of 156. As I said, it was a clock on 220. Now, wind damage is a phenomenal event. So whereas some people may say the difference between 220 and 156 is not so much. But for after you have the highest spectrum, which is 150 miles, so to speak, every incremental 5 miles of winds is exponential damage. So you do the math to know what's the difference between 156 and 220, and you'll see that. So the lesson for us going forward now, we definitely have to strengthen our code. We have to revise the code, both in terms of the cubic code, and of course, our code in Dominica Building Code is also accredited or affiliated to our code in Dominica, because our code in Dominica is part of the OECS code, which is also a sub-region of the CARICOM. So it means, therefore, we're going to have to strengthen our codes, and as part of the review and the reconstruction approach, we're going to have to look in terms of our standards and our practices. Now, I say our practices is very important. These practices will start at the design, and then it goes to the next stage of the design, which is the actual construction. Now, bearing in mind, as I said, historically, we have had this cultural norm that people feel that when it comes times for the construction of the home, they can take matters into the hand. But the onus is going to be on the building control officers now to really be firm and to really be unresolved with the building contractors and homeowners. So we have been hearing, of course, we want to put into context that very quickly, that timber roof and timber buildings cannot stand hurricane. I'm not sure where that thing came from. Now we have to be mindful of the fact, because quite a few persons now were saying we're just going to construct concrete roofs. Now, I have been informed, I can't tell you exactly where's the place, but fortunately a dog saved someone who had a concrete roof. The dog was back in, it was very uneasy during the event. Minutes after the person left the room, the entire building collapsed. Now, but the point I want to make about the concrete roof, that people are talking about concrete roof, we must bear in mind that we're exposed to hazards within the region. And the climatic hazards that we have are wind and earthquakes. Now, the seismic things that is created, well, whereas in a hurricane, you get warning, and if you're rich enough, like my good friend, you can decide to mount to St. Martin or somewhere in event before it comes. But earthquake doesn't tell you when it comes. Now, Mr. Burnett can attest to that if he wants, because he's another engineer in the room like myself. When you talk about seismic loads and seismic disturbances, you talk about mass, you talk about weight. Well, people normally see it, but we prefer to call it mass. And when you get an earthquake, you get what you call tremblement de terre, the ground shakes. We call it in the technical term ground acceleration. Now, for those of us who still understand a bit about physics, physics tell you force is really mass times acceleration of gravity. So it means, therefore, the heavier you make the building, is the worse the destructive force going to be. So you would take out the building from a timber and you put it into concrete, you're making this building heavier. So where you figure you may sharp it from a hurricane, you're setting up yourself for an earthquake. More so because many of the times that we figure the engineer can tell you what size of bar to put and how to space it, because you're a contractor, you're doing that all your life and everything else. You go and you mess with that steel in that concrete structure, the entire building is compromised. So we have to take into consideration that we're looking at all forces. And we don't have to go too far. I've been writing Dominica most of the more architectural, momentous artifice that we have down here are wooden structures. And you notice that the shape of the roof, you will have roof between 30 to 45 miles thick. You'll notice most of the time they'll use hardwoods, and they use dovetail and have different joints that you pin with hardwoods. You'll see the buildings properly braced. So even sometimes you will see the guy have a roof, and right in the middle of it, you'll see you have a big 3x4 going right across. And then in the corner of it, you'll see you have cross braces, so that whole thing now is robust, it is tight. You see fellas putting on wooden structures today, just run a couple 2x4s and don't care about the spacing, and they make up a box and everything. When that thing's subjected to a hurricane, on one face, you have something pushing you. And on the other side, you have a pull. Now, when something pulling you, it's almost like a suction. So suction force is, towards us, you know what a vacuum is. A vacuum, when you use it on the field, you can see it sucking up things. So you have a forward-moving force at one time and something pulling. If that thing is not braced, the torsion alone will distort the whole thing. But if the thing was well braced and well designed, it would withstand the forces. Now, I just want to comment very quickly before I yield to my other colleagues. From what we have seen in terms of the effect of the damage, most of the damages that we have sustained in Dominica is as a result of roof damage. And the mode of failure we see on the roof, more or less, is the pulling out or the shattering of the roof covering. Now, a lot of people, you will see, they went and they did fancy buildings. They did a few things right. So you'll see from the ring beam to the plate, the 2x4 or 3x4 plate, it is well anchored with a J-bolt into the concrete. And then the rafter fixed onto that plate is also done in a very profound manner. You have a hurricane tie between the plate and the rafter. But listen to the classic. They're looking for style and they're looking for things that are looking good. So most of them want what they call exposed rafter. So they go on to buy the T111, which is the groove ply, and they nail the groove ply onto the the rafters, the 2x6. And then on top of the plywood, they nail down the pole lines, which is normally the 2x3s. Now, the destructive force during a hurricane is the uplift or the upthrust or the suction force then, what pulls up. Now, when you nail something which is the same direction, it is parallel or perpendicular, not perpendicular, it's parallel to the force, direction of the force. It will just pull it out. Whether you have that nail 6 inches or 12 inches, I don't care. It makes no difference. It's in the same direction of the pull. It will take it out. So you'll notice most of the roof that you will see, the fancy roof, if you even drive by today, you will still see that a wooden member, which is the pole line, is still tied on to the roof sheeting, because they did one thing right. They screwed the roof sheetings into the pole line, so it was well attached, well connected. But the floor was between the pole line and the rafter, which was nailed. Now, clearly, you could see in some instances where that happened next to it, the very house is the same design in terms of the type of material, but that roof stayed. So you will see either one thing, either the design or the shape of the roof was different. Yeah, so I am saying all this to say is nothing wrong with the type of construction. What is wrong, the gap, the disconnect, is the malpractice and techniques that's being used. So going forward, we're going to have to ensure there is stronger penalties for people defying what is required, and so we can save ourselves some of the hardships and some of the burdens that we're experiencing today. So going forward, we really want to ensure that we take the opportunity to do things better, and as have been so eloquently articulated and proclaimed by the Prime Minister, we are going to do it better than before. And from the Ministry of Housing standpoint as well, government has already begun to look at suitable, safe, affordable housing solutions. And of course, because where I sit to give advice on policy. I don't sit to decide on policy. So it wouldn't be my turn now to disclose anything as to what is going to be. But I can give you the strongest assurance that from the Ministry of Housing standpoint, the biggest commitment and interest has been already given by government, and we are doing everything studiously to ensure that is happening. As I said moments ago, we have in the field all over the country right now the support of our various colleagues from the various line ministries, assessors doing the necessary assessments, so we know exactly what is the situation on the ground and how we could strategize in terms of the building back better for accommodating people and for ensuring that the construction practice is properly done. I will stop there for the moment and allow my other colleagues to have the introduction. Thank you very much.
You mentioned how not to do this thing when you refer to T111.
Yes.
How do you really do it?
Okay, all right, okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Joseph. Okay, all right, so for instance, here the T111. the objective for the builder, not the builder, sorry, the homeowner, is to have a pretty looking interior. So you want to see his T111. Now, when you build, the biggest problem you're faced with, or when you design, is to ensure that how you pay attention to joints and connections, because they definitely are the planes of failure or points of failure. You're going to have to connect the rafter to the pole line. So what can be done, you have two options. You can choose to have the T111, which is the groove plywood, nailed on the surface of the 2x6, so underneath the 2x6. So you'll no longer be able to see the 2x6, but you'll be seeing the T111. And that will allow him to have direct connection between the pole line and the rafter. The pole line is the one going across, the rafter is the one spanning from the roof apex to the end of the wall. So that will enable him to have a hurricane tie or hurricane strap between the pole line and the rafter. And for many instances, that was the disconnect. There was no hurricane tie between the pole line and the rafter. So the whole thing pop up. The other approach that could be used, of course, it's all a question. There's always a balance between design and cost. If he really wants to see the edges of his rafters, and he wants to see the T111 at the back of that, what you're going to have to do then, at the end of the day, you're going to have the rafters at closer intervals. So normally, when you have the rafter span, for rule of thumb, the planning will always tell you, based on the span of the roof, you cannot go more than 2 feet, which is about 600 millimeters. You can have a situation where you might have to go around 18 inches, about 450 centimeters, if he wants to put the T111 on top. And for so doing, he will then have to screw the pole line, because you have the T111 on top of the rafter. So you now have to screw with a design screw, that is. So engineer will design what is the load to go under the screw, tell you what the size of the screw is, and what kind of threading the screw should have. So you'll now screw the T111 into the rafter, and then you place the pole line across onto the thing, and then screw, not nail the pole line, but you will screw the pole line into the rafter. And then by so you'll have a proper resisting joint and connection, so that you don't have the popping out that's happening.